In 1942, when Germany was at the height of its power, just one mistake led to disaster. By mid-1942, Nazi Germany had made remarkable military advances. The Eastern Front was progressing rapidly. The German army had pushed deep into Soviet territory. The Battle of Stalingrad was on the horizon, a pivotal moment in World War II. At the same time, the German forces were firmly in control of much of Western Europe. Their economic and military strength appeared unmatched. But in the midst of this dominance, a decision was made. A single order issued by Adolf Hitler would forever alter the course of the war. The order to divert resources and forces away from the main goal of Stalingrad and instead focus on the oil fields of the Caucasus. This shift in strategy would prove to be one of the most significant mistakes of the war. The decision to split forces across multiple fronts weakened Germany's position. The order came at a critical time. German forces were already stretched thin. Yet Hitler insisted that Stalingrad could be captured later, and the oil resources were more vital. The troops now had to fight a two-front battle, Stalingrad and the southern oil fields. This decision led to logistical chaos and confusion in the German ranks. As German forces advanced further south, they encountered fierce Soviet resistance, and the weather turned hostile. Supply lines were stretched to their breaking point. The move towards the Caucasus was an attempt to secure vital oil supplies, which were critical for maintaining the German war machine. But this shift left Stalingrad exposed and the German forces overextended. Hitler's decision to divide the army was seen as a miscalculation. As the Germans pushed forward into the southern region, their supply lines became more vulnerable. The Soviets began to regroup and take advantage of the weakening position of the German forces. The impact of the order was felt almost immediately. The German offensive stalled. Instead of securing a quick victory, the Germans found themselves caught in a deadly trap. The strategy that had once seemed so promising now seemed disastrous. The German offensive struggles. By the end of the summer of 1942, German forces had advanced deep into the Soviet Union. The initial plan was straightforward: capture Stalingrad, then move south to secure the Caucasus oil fields. However, the shift in focus towards the oil fields had immediate consequences. German forces found themselves engaged on two fronts. The advance towards Stalingrad stalled as the Soviet defense grew more organized. At the same time, the push south became logistically impossible. The Germans were not prepared for the harsh terrain and the supply issues that would soon arise. The troops were forced to rely on stretched-out supply lines, which were increasingly vulnerable to Soviet attacks. The Soviet counteroffensive. By late autumn 1942, the Soviets had fully recovered from the initial shock. Soviet forces launched a counteroffensive, and the Germans, already overextended, found themselves in a vulnerable position. Stalingrad, a city once considered secondary to the oil fields, became a critical focal point of the conflict. As German troops fought to hold the city, Soviet reinforcements flooded the region. The encirclement of the German Sixth Army began in November 1942, catching the German forces by surprise. The battle for Stalingrad had now become a battle for survival. The impact of Hitler's order, the decision to focus on the Caucasus oil fields, had diverted crucial resources. This left the Sixth Army in a precarious situation. The long-range supply lines were cut off, and the German forces in Stalingrad found themselves isolated. The Soviets had closed in, trapping almost 300,000 German soldiers inside the city. What had been a major victory just a few months earlier had turned into a massive disaster. Hitler's decision, initially aimed at securing oil and strengthening the German military, now resulted in heavy casualties and a strategic loss. The final days of Stalingrad. As winter set in, conditions in Stalingrad worsened. The German forces were not equipped for the freezing temperatures. The trapped soldiers lacked food, ammunition, and medical supplies. Despite Hitler's orders to never retreat, the situation became untenable. German soldiers in Stalingrad began to surrender in large numbers. By February 1943, the German Sixth Army had been decimated. Over 100,000 German soldiers were either killed or captured. The Battle of Stalingrad ended with a complete Soviet victory. This was a turning point in the war, marking the first major defeat of Nazi Germany. The aftermath of the order. The consequences of Hitler's decision were clear. The diversion of forces to the south and the failure to secure Stalingrad left Germany in a weakened state. The loss of the Sixth Army in Stalingrad represented a significant blow to German morale. It exposed critical flaws in the German military strategy, and the German High Command had to confront the reality that their forces were not invincible. This battle marked the beginning of the end for Nazi Germany in the East. Hitler's decision had turned Germany's moment of apparent advantage into a long-term disaster, the strategic shift in Germany's plans. After the defeat at Stalingrad, the strategic landscape in Europe changed dramatically. The German High Command reassessed their position on the Eastern Front. The loss of the Sixth Army was irreplaceable. The decision to prioritize the Caucasus oil fields over Stalingrad had proved disastrous. Now Germany had to shift its focus from expansion to defense. This marked the beginning of Germany's retreat from the east. The previously powerful German military began to retreat across vast stretches of land. The Soviets, now emboldened, launched further offensives towards the west. The impact on Nazi morale. The loss at Stalingrad severely affected German morale. Soldiers, many of whom had seen the brutality of battle firsthand, began to lose faith in the mission. The image of the crushed Sixth Army and the defeat in the East became a defining moment. For Hitler, the Stalingrad defeat was a turning point. His earlier confidence in the invincibility of the German army was shattered. This defeat marked a psychological blow to both the soldiers and the German public. The idea of a swift and decisive victory now seemed increasingly unlikely. The German response. After Stalingrad, the German military attempted to regroup and defend the remaining territories. However, resources were already stretched thin. There was little support for the growing demands of the Eastern Front. Hitler, still unwilling to admit his mistakes, ordered more aggressive offensives, but they lacked coordination. The German forces were divided and unprepared for the increasingly organized Soviet counterattacks. Despite these efforts, it was clear that the tide had turned. The Germans were no longer the invincible force they once were. The failure of the Axis powers. As the Soviets pushed forward, the German allies began to falter as well. Italy, Japan, and Hungary, who had once supported Germany's expansion, now faced their own crises. In North Africa, the Axis powers were losing ground to the Allies. In the West, the D-Day invasion loomed on the horizon, and the German army was stretched across multiple fronts. The once unified Axis powers were now disjointed. This added further pressure on Germany's already overstretched military. Transition, the long road to defeat. The Battle of Stalingrad was not just a military defeat, it was a turning point in the war. Germany's strategic mistakes, starting with the order to divert resources away from Stalingrad, had set the stage for a broader collapse. What had been an empire on the verge of total dominance was now struggling to maintain its position. The consequences of that single order were being felt across Europe, and with each passing month it became clearer that Germany's victory was no longer inevitable. The shift in German strategy. After Stalingrad, Hitler's strategy changed drastically. He ordered a defensive approach on the Eastern Front, trying to halt the Soviet advance. However, the Soviet momentum was now unstoppable. The Germans, still reeling from their losses, could no longer launch large offensives. Instead, they focused on defending key positions and trying to stabilize their front lines. This change in strategy marked the end of German offensive dominance in the East. The impact on Nazi leadership. The defeat at Stalingrad was a personal blow to Hitler. His confidence in military invincibility had been shattered. His decisions, once absolute, were now being questioned by his officers. Hitler's leadership became increasingly erratic. His refusal to admit mistakes or accept advice from his generals further weakened the German war effort. The German High Command began to see the consequences of blindly following Hitler's orders. The effects on the German army. For the German soldiers, the defeat at Stalingrad was more than just a military loss. Many of the soldiers who survived the battle returned home physically and mentally broken. The spirit of invincibility that had once characterized the Wehrmacht was now gone. Low morale spread through the ranks. The once elite fighting force had been severely weakened, both in terms of manpower and confidence. The heavy losses suffered by the German army meant that they were now on the defensive rather than maintaining the aggressive stance they had previously enjoyed. The changing dynamics of the war. The turning point in Stalingrad opened the door for the Allied forces to gain momentum. The Soviets, emboldened by their victory, began pushing westward towards German-occupied territories. The Allies in the West began to plan for an invasion of Europe. With the German military on the defensive, their ability to hold multiple fronts was severely compromised. The war, which had seemed like a German victory just months earlier, now appeared to be turning in favor of the Allies. Transition, the road to defeat. The events in Stalingrad, caused by Hitler's strategic error, became the beginning of the end for Nazi Germany. The loss of over 100,000 German soldiers, the destruction of the Sixth Army, and the failure to secure crucial oil fields marked a critical shift. From this point onward, Germany was fighting to maintain its hold on Europe rather than expanding its influence. The momentum had shifted, and the defeat in Stalingrad was felt across all German territories. The collapse of Germany's Eastern Front. The loss of Stalingrad marked the beginning of Germany's retreat on the Eastern Front. The once dominant German forces found themselves pushed back by a well-organized Soviet military. The failure to secure Stalingrad not only crippled the Sixth Army, but also forced Germany to divert critical resources to a losing battle. As the Soviets advanced, the Germans found themselves unable to hold their positions, let alone launch any further offensives. This retreat continued through 1943, with the Soviets steadily reclaiming territory previously occupied by the Germans. The wider impact of the decision. The consequences of Hitler's decision were not limited to the Eastern Front. The Allied forces in the West saw this as an opportunity to increase their pressure on German-held territories. The D-Day invasion in June 1944 was the turning point in the Western Front. With Germany now engaged on two fronts, their military position weakened dramatically. The Allied advance and the ongoing Soviet push spelled disaster for Nazi Germany. The loss at Stalingrad contributed to Germany's inability to defend its occupied territories. Hitler's leadership in final days. As the war continued, Hitler's leadership became increasingly erratic. The refusal to acknowledge the failure at Stalingrad compounded his mistakes. He maintained his never-retreat policy even as Germany's position deteriorated further. By the end of 1944, Germany was completely surrounded. The final blow came with the Soviet capture of Berlin in 1945. Hitler, who had once believed that Germany was invincible, was now confronted with the reality of total defeat. The legacy of the order. The decision to prioritize the oil fields over Stalingrad, though a military strategy at the time, ultimately doomed Germany's war effort. The loss of Stalingrad had significant consequences. Over 100,000 German soldiers were killed or captured. The morale of the German military was shattered. Hitler's leadership became increasingly isolated as his orders were questioned. While Stalingrad was a turning point in the war, the final collapse of Germany came with the combined pressures of the Eastern and Western fronts. The end of Germany's superiority. The order to focus on the Caucasus oil fields ended any hopes of a swift victory for Germany. The Eastern Front had become a drain on German resources, and the Western Allies capitalized on this weakness. Germany's strategy of overextension led to a series of defeats that ultimately ended in its downfall. Hitler's decision marked the point at which Germany lost its advantage. From this moment forward, Germany was in a fight for survival, not conquest. The order that changed everything set the stage for Nazi Germany's defeat and ultimately the end of the war in Europe.